Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel on the War Relocation Authority Farm Labor. I'm your moderator, Grace Morizawa, Education Coordinator for the Japanese American Historical Society in San Francisco, fondly referred to as NINJAHS, NJAHS. Here we are. With me today, in order of their appearance on the panel, are our panelists, Hanako Wakatsuki Chung. Hanako is a Honolulu National Historical Site's first National Park Superintendent. Congratulations, Hanako. I know this is a big job. Prior to working in Hawaii, she was Chief Interpretation and Education at Minidoka National Historical Site. Hanako, do you just want to wave at everybody? All right. Next is Dakota Russell, Executive Director of Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. Here's Dakota. Morgen Young is a senior historian with a historical research associate. She served as the project director of uprooted Japanese farm labor camps during World War II. Morgen. And Elaine Koyama, who, in her own words, has embarked on a third career, that of author, speaker, and facilitator. She will share her father's story, who recruited sugar beet factory workers from the camps. We're here today to begin to tell you the story of the World War II farm labor done by incarcerees who toiled in the camps, in small labor farms across the country, and on temporary leave. Ironically, farmers of Japanese descent who were forcibly removed from harvesting their own lands were counted on by the WRA to use their skills and knowledge to make the barren and desolate camps flourish. The camps also had a secondary purpose, a kind of 20th century westward expansion. The story of farm labor is one of exploitation and incarcerees, endurance, resistance, and ingenuity. Please put your questions in chat. We'll have a Q&A after all of the panel speaks. So without further ado, here's Hanako.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. So what I'm going to do is kind of contextualize and give an overview of the program. So then, Dakota, Morgen, and then Elaine could kind of dive a little bit deeper in some of these stories that they're going to be sharing. So on the next slide, I would like to just show you guys a map of all the incarceration sites to just kind of contextualize it a little bit. Many people, over the course of today, you're probably learning about all these different facilities and whatnot. So historically, General John DeWitt, when he decided that he was going to remove all people of Japanese ancestry, there was this need to find all these other WRA sites. So originally, they identified Manzanar and Poston as sites for the Issei. But then when it was the Nisei and the Sansei were going to be taken away, they needed to find, these places. So on the next slide, it kind of zooms in onto an image where you could see that there's Tule Lake, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain on there. So those were actually Bureau reclamation sites. So when the government was trying to find new sites to actually house or incarcerate Japanese Americans during this time, they were looking for other federal agencies and other state and county lands to see where they could establish these sites at. So Tule Lake, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain were Bureau reclamation sites, and the Bureau Rec was like, "Hey, we have land that you guys could use." And the agreement was that they were going to provide these large patches of land, but they need Japanese American laborers to help irrigate them for agricultural uses. So these sites at Tule Lake, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain, they're a lot larger than some of the other sites land-wise. Like Minidoka was 33,000 acres large. Heart Mountain was about 46,000 acres large. And then in this map, you could kind of see around Minidoka and Idaho, there's Nissa, Adrian, Twin Falls, Rupert, Shelley. Those are the sites that Morgan's going to be talking about with the Farm Security Administration. So at least you kind of see some of the stuff that she's going to be talking about later on. So on the next slide, you could kind of see that these lands that the Bureau of Reclamation had, they're just, high desert. And the whole point of the Bureau of Reclamation was to reclaim the desert for agricultural uses. So when a lot of these sites were chosen, all you had was just this bare sagegrass areas. And then, they had to build a city on this. But why did they use these lands? So if we go to the next slide, you could kind of see we have some folks there where they needed to feed the incarcerees. So, with these sites, you have like tens of thousands of people, coming out. Tule Lake ended up having, I think, peak population 18,000 people, while Minidoka was around 9,000, and I think Heart Mountain was approximately around the 10,000 mark for peak population. But you're feeding people, 3 meals a day, and they needed to grow the food. So if you go to the next slide, you could kind of see that when people were coming in for food, they had to line up. And at first, a lot of the food that was provided was kind of like commodities. There was a lot of canned foods and whatnot. But what they ended up wanting to do was like, hey, why don't we start, growing our own food, making the site self-sufficient. And so like Minidoka within 1 year was self-sufficient to provide enough food to feed the incarcerees at Minidoka. But the whole goal for some of these Bureau Rec sites was actually to overproduce and then send produce and other agricultural means to the other sites so then they could be a little bit more self-sufficient. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that there are some fresh produce that was being grown out here. And also incarcerees were able to petition to grow ethnically appropriate foods as well. So that was really good. And we'll see a slide later that will kind of go through some of the products or produces that they were growing. On the next slide, you could kind of see where products were stored in warehouses and whatnot. So some of them, they're purchasing items in like sugar and whatnot, and other stuff they're growing and they're packaging to send out as well. So if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see a map of Minidoka. So I'm going to kind of focus on Minidoka as a WRA site to look at it. So you can kind of see there's the residential blocks. So those are all the squares. So that makes up approximately 900 acres of the 33,000 acres. So the whole 33,000 acres is not really shown on this hand-drawn map, but you could kind of see where the incarcerees were farming, and if we go to the next slide, we could take a look at some of the products that they're growing there. So, you have the general cabbage, potatoes, broccoli, but then you have eggplant and, there's turnips, beans, peppers, and eventually they even start to grow soybeans. So Minidoka actually had a tofu factory. So that's how they're trying to, make sure that there was enough sustenance for folks so they could, have good quality food, because there was a lot of food poisoning at the beginning of the WRA sites when they were open because of the quality of food. So this was one aspect where incarcerees kind of had some agency of what they were eating, even though they didn't have full control of it. So if we go to the next slide, another big aspect was the sugar beet industry. So we had, folks working on farms that wasn't on the property itself at Minidoka, but their labor were being outsourced. So, and a lot of people, hear about sugar beets, and it's because that was a big commodity during that time, because it was a byproduct of sugar that helped stabilize munitions. So Japanese Americans actually was part of the war effort. A lot of people think about Manzanar with the camouflage net factory, but the whole agricultural aspects of sugar beet is also part of the war effort as well. And then if you go to the next slide, you kind of see there's some folks who are gathering some sugar beets as well there. And let's go to the next slide, where we can kind of talk about a little bit about irrigation. So I was telling you earlier that the Bureau of Reclamation really wanted Japanese Americans to help develop the property. They wanted to take these arid desert lands and make them farmlands, right? Make them arable. And so a lot of Japanese Americans helped build a lot of the canals and the laterals that some of them are still in use today. So in Idaho, the whole area where Minidoka's at and like Twin Falls and Jerome is known as the Magic Valley, because it's so magical that we took the desert and we made it into agricultural lands that are really productive. And a lot of those laterals were built by Japanese Americans that's north of the North Side Canal. And so Japanese Americans actually built about 5 miles of the Milner-Gooding Canal, which is still in use today for that. So the agricultural legacy of the Japanese Americans on the landscape of Idaho and Wyoming and Northern California, it's not really taught too much. So we need to make sure that we learn more about it. If you go to the next slide, you could kind of see that they also did other things with farming where it's like, we had a chicken coop. There was also like sometimes they grew pigs and whatnot as well, or have a pigsty and whatnot. So there are other ways for them to, have meat and eggs. And then if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see an awesome landscape of a farmer out over at Heart Mountain with Heart Mountain in the background. But the last thing I kind of want to end on, and I have a series of images here, is the root cellar. So the next slide, you could kind of see there's a root cellar where I think both at Heart Mountain and Minidoka is that the root cellar was constructed by Japanese Americans. So it's a known structure that we know that Japanese Americans constructed. And the designs, at least in Idaho, is a little bit different from other root cellars in the nearby area. And it was also one of the jobs that people wanted really bad to work at, because during the hot summers, it's around like 66 degrees in there, 68 degrees. So that's kind of interesting. So the next slide is a contemporary image of the Minidoka root cellar, where we're going through a stabilization process, but it's been left alone for almost 75 years. The next slide, you could kind of see an interior shot of one of the root cellars. On the next slide, you'll see the root cellar over at Heart Mountain. And so Heart Mountain had actually the largest root cellar system. I think that there was a couple. The one that they currently have is the size of a football field, so that's pretty cool. And then the next slide, you can kind of see the interesting way that they insulated the root cellar to store all the vegetables and crops that they're growing, where you just have layer of like hay and grass and whatnot that ended up keeping the area cool. So next slide is also another interesting image of looking from the inside out. And then if we go back to the next slide, I just wanted to show again where, Tule Lake, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain is. It's kind of in the Pacific Northwest area, but it is part of the legacy. And the whole point, again, with the Bureau of Reclamation, wanting Japanese Americans to be, developing these sites was to then irrigate it and get it ready for the Homestead Act. So when we go to the next slide, a lot of white veterans were able to participate in this program where they were able to put their name into a land lottery. And if their name was drawn, they gotten parcels from, I believe it's like 40 acres to up to like 160 acre parcels. Many folks were not farmers, so they had to learn how to farm. So the image on the right side is a picture of a farm in a day where they had like the soil conservation group come in, teach these new farmers how to farm, how to dig laterals, clean out stuff, when to plant, and then they actually built a house for the Hermans, which they're the ones on the left picture. So that's where the offices for Minidoka are at. But it's really interesting when you see that, where Japanese Americans were not actually allowed to participate in this program at the time, where it was specifically for returning white veterans. But there was a weird nuance over at Tule Lake, where there was a POW camp nearby. And the POWs were actually caught on the front lines. They're German and Italian POWs. They were allowed to participate in the land lottery that was meant for American citizens, while Japanese Americans who were American citizens and fought for the United States were not allowed to participate. So that's where you see some of the discrepancies of the programs that's a little bit more race related. So that's essentially the end of my talk. If you get to the last slide, there's my contact information. And then I am going to turn it over to Dakota for his talk.
Hey, Dakota.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Thanks to Hanako for turning things over to me. I'm Dakota Russell, Executive Director of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. And I want to dig in a little more to the stories here of what was going on within the camps themselves as far as farming, and specifically into Heart Mountain. And so when we talk about food within the camps, we tend to focus on a narrative that talks about the quality of food. You know, this is what most of the incarcerees remember when they speak about meals within the camps, is that the quality was very, very poor. And some of that is a result of kind of what Hanako had said there at the beginning, is that a lot of the food that was coming into here was, in the early days, was supplied by the Army Quartermaster Corps. And in the case of Heart Mountain, most of that food was actually coming from Denver, or sometimes even as far away as Kansas City. So any of the fresh produce that reached Heart Mountain here in Wyoming was generously described as overripe. In fact, most of the food that they had here was, you know, either frozen food or canned food or highly processed food. People talk about, you know, hot dogs showing up several times a week for any of the 3 meals of the day. You could see them in the mess halls because they were cheap and they were easy to keep, right? But the story of the quality of the food is not the only reason that these farm programs are created within the camps. The quality, of course, was fairly low, but there was actually a real threat to the food supplies that they had going on. And that actually begins right at Heart Mountain. So in the fall of 1942, a reporter from the Denver Post winds up coming up to Heart Mountain to inspect the grounds of the camp. He really irritates the camp's administrators and leaders because apparently most of his inspection of the camp is done from a bar stool at the Irma Hotel in Cody. But he, at the bar, winds up meeting a disgruntled former employee of Heart Mountain, a white guy who had been hired on to the staff as a mess hall steward. And this man tells him all about how Heart Mountain doesn't have to follow any of the rationing that everybody else has to do during the war, how huge shipments of food are being sent in there and they're hoarded. The funniest story is probably he talks about mess hall attics that are just full of hams. So these stories start going into the Denver Post about the attics full of hams at Heart Mountain, and all of the extra food they have, and essentially how the Japanese Americans are being pampered within the camps, which is a narrative that kind of plays out early on when folks think they aren't being punished enough by being sent to the camps. And so that winds up having some very real effects. It eventually reaches the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And these stories really influence them. And if you flip to the next slide, you'll see exactly what comes of this. The project directors for all of the camps are told that it is necessary now that they produce or face food shortages at their camps, because the Congress is seriously looking at this point about starting to cut their quartermaster rations if they don't start becoming self-sustaining. Now, plans for this had already begun. As Hanako said, a big part of this is that the Bureau of Reclamation wanted these camps, at least in the case of Heart Mountain, to be irrigated as part of this. So already there was an irrigation project in place. People were already planning for a farm, but this definitely intensifies the need for it. This steps up the timetable. And so at Heart Mountain, they were starting not with agriculturally ready, but with, in the words of the WWII, the potential for agriculture. And so the canals are not cut yet. It's still high desert up here. There is a canal leading out from the reservoir, but it only makes it falls short about 2 miles short of the camp there. And so this is something that the incarcerees themselves are going to have to complete before they can actually start a successful farming program out here. And that's really where things begin to kick in. And so there are 4 men who really take the lead on this, and you'll see pictures of them here in the next slide. So we have got on the Heart Mountain staff 2 white guys at the start right here, Glenn Hartman and Alden Ingram. Glenn and Alden were both from here in Cody. They had both worked for a long time for the University of Wyoming with their experimental farm. And so they were up for a challenge. They were always interested in trying new things. That said, Glenn Hartman always said that the quality that helped him out the most was knowing when to step aside and let other better folks take control of the project. And they did have 2 very talented farmers and farm managers within the incarcerated themselves. You'll see him right here, James Ito, who is over on the far right there holding the melon, and Eiichi Sakawe, who is going to be sort of the statistician. Both of these guys have come from longtime farming families. The Sakawes owned an orchard outside of San Jose. James Ito's family had run a series of produce stands throughout Los Angeles and had a farm outside of the city there. And then had also just finished up a degree at Berkeley in agriculture as well. And so extremely talented people. And the 4 of these men meet in the fall of 1942 and decide to divvy up the jobs that need done. So Glenn Hartman takes over the canal project and starts in the fall of 1942 and takes a team of incarcerees out there that start digging and working on it up until Christmas Day in 1942, when the ground finally freezes so hard they can't get any more work done. Alden Ingram, in the meantime, takes on the project of finding the necessary equipment, the tractors and everything else that are going to be needed in order to make this happen. Eiichi is given the responsibility of finding a seed base for the camp. And then James Ito puts himself in charge of going out and taking soil samples and inspecting the whole project to see where the fields could eventually go. You'll see where they eventually landed here in the next slide. Now, James knew early on a little bit about what kind of qualities that the soil was going to need in order to grow the vegetables that they needed. And obviously, he did not have a lot of time to adjust the soil quality anywhere, to work on it. And so he went around, took soil samples, sent them out to the University of Wyoming, and studied them and decided he picked the best crops for the best fields. And so his decision was to start at the Shoshone River, which you see in the foreground of this slide right here, and then work his way back toward the camp and take the most fertile soil along the riverbanks first, and then work up from there. So that meant they were starting several acres down below where the actual residential area was, which is going to cause a problem eventually for our tractor drivers. The crew that drove the tractors there would head out at daybreak in the morning and head all the way down toward the Shoshone River to start tilling these fields. Now, this was especially difficult work because all of this was high desert. There wasn't any irrigation in here yet. And so this is just dry, very hard-packed soil that has never been farmed before that they are working to dig into now. So it's extremely hard work. They would spend the whole day out there and head back. Now, the problem was that the motor pool workers, who were mostly white, didn't start their day until 8 o'clock. So it was impossible for the farmers to gas up their tractors before they left for the fields. And although they asked and asked over and over again, the motor pool workers would not give them the key to the gate that they needed to get to the fuel tanks in the motor pool. And so there was simmering tension between them. One day in the middle of a heat wave in the summer of 1943, the farmers are out working on the southern part of the project and start running out of gas, one after another. Eventually, all of these angry tractor drivers make their way back toward the camp, where they surround the motor pool workers, trap them inside of the garage, and are coming after them with farm implements. It sounds comical, but actually it frightened the camp's administration because this was really the first of the resistance movements at Heart Mountain is this was the first thing that was looking to boil over into a riot, possibly. So they shut down all the schools. They even thought about calling the military guards into the camp, which was a last resort. But finally, they were able to reach resolution between the two groups. The farmers got their key, and so the tractor drivers were able to get their own fuel after that. Now, that's some of the problems happening with the equipments and the labor force there. But at the same time, they were also trying to find seeds. I mentioned that was the job of Aichi Sakawa. And he was fortunate in that asking around, he was able to find a couple of seed growers within the camp that still had supplies back on the West Coast. And so the story of Heart Mountain is that these Japanese American farmers actually sent back for their seed base. In fact, Kazuo Hachimanji is believed to have been allowed to return back to the West Coast under armed guard so he could gather up his seed base and bring it back. And so this really forms the core of the Heart Mountain seed base. But they also involve local farmers as well. The Kawano and Ando families, who had been living in Park County since the 1920s and 30s and therefore didn't have to go to camp, were actually very instrumental in helping the farming program because they'd been farming here for years and years and years, and they donated part of their seed base as well as a lot of their knowledge toward the farming effort. And in the next slide, we'll actually see some of the other contributors to the knowledge that helped them farm here. And these are the farmers from Washington's Yakima Valley. And these farmers, there weren't very many of them. Now, most of Heart Mountain actually came from Southern California there, San Jose and Los Angeles regions. But about 1,200 people who were at first supposed to be destined for Minidoka, but wound up getting rerouted to Heart Mountain, came from rural Washington, where they had been farmers before the war. And while growing in the Pacific Northwest was not identical to growing in Wyoming, they were used to the much shorter season that Wyoming had. We only had about 90 to 100 days of a growing season, so pretty tight, especially by Southern California standards. But these farmers were a little more used to it and knew some tricks right here. And so they actually were instrumental in building the hotbeds, which were sort of beds, kind of like mini greenhouses, right, that would set on a hillside facing the sun there. And after the plants were planted in here, these would be covered over in glass. And so the sun could get in, but the frost couldn't get in. And then that way they were able to actually start plants sooner there. On the next side, you'll see what they did once the plants got out into the fields. Because it is Wyoming and because sometimes even in June we'll get a freak snowstorm, sometimes on the 4th of July it'll snow. And so when the plants were still young and vulnerable out there, the Yakima Valley farmers actually introduced the idea of putting hot caps on top of them. These are little wax paper caps that they had used up in Washington. And essentially they do the same as the beds. They protect the plants from weather, from frost, while still allowing them to get enough sunlight to function inside of there. Of course, vegetables are not the only thing that they are growing here at Heart Mountain. In the next slide, you can also see that we have a hog and chicken farm. And this was largely fell to the Saijo family. And they had a chicken farm back on the West Coast there. And they very much made this a family affair, mainly because they felt like they couldn't trust the other workers that they hired on to work on the chicken farm. Chickens kept coming down with what was called barrack sickness within the camp, which is when apparently the chickens became so deadly ill that their workers had to carry them back to the barracks and then would sadly report that none of the chickens ever recovered from it. So theft was a real problem for them early on, and demand for eggs especially was high within the camp too. And so they kept it very much in the family, running the hogs and chickens in a small portion of it right there. Interestingly, the two Saijo teenage boys had enough of farming by the time they were done with Heart Mountain. Gomper Saijo became a well-known outsider artist, and Albert Saijo became one of the beet poets shortly after this. So did not strike up a lifelong love of hogs and chickens here. As these facilities are developing, Hartman and his crew are working on the canal, and we can see in the next slide as they are coming to a finish on it. Now, not only did they have to actually cut close to 2 miles more of canal there, they actually had to go back the full 7 miles and waterproof the whole thing with bentonite before it could actually function. And so they were right up against the wire. It was late June by the time that you got to scene, which is the first water flowing into the Heart Mountain Canal there. By this point, it was getting very, very dry. In fact, if it hadn't been for one of those freak snowstorms in June, they probably would have lost a lot of plants. But the snow actually put some needed moisture back in the soil there. But irrigation starts up in June. So by the end of the summer, on the next slide, you can see they are already harvesting food. Harvesting is a community-wide effort. They wound up having 52 different types of vegetables that they grew here at Heart Mountain, with several varieties of each, growing over 1,200 acres. So they needed all of the support of the community. And of course, by the end of the summer in 1943, a lot of the men were able to get passes to go out elsewhere and work. And so it became a largely female-driven operation. And even many of the tractor drivers were female by that point. But here you can see a cross-section. These are volunteers who would come out to work on the farm. And among them there, that white woman that you see in the middle is Virgil Payne, who headed up the social welfare program at the camp. In the last slide here, you'll see a little bit about what Hanako was talking about earlier, is the cellars that we had right here to house them. Now, this is over 300 feet long and about 40 feet wide. This is when it was under construction. The incarcerated actually logged all of this timber themselves and hauled it back to the camp from the Shoshone National Forest nearby. And so all of this is hand-cut timber that you're looking at right here. There was one excavator that they had on the project. Everything else was done by hand. And so they really are truly impressive structures. One has unfortunately caved in now, but the surviving one we're in the process of restoring. And hopefully by the end of next summer, people will get to come out and see it and hear the story of the agriculture program at Heart Mountain. Just as Hanako said that Minidoka was called the Magic Valley out there, Heart Mountain has its own nickname. A lot of folks around here call this the Heart Mountain Miracle, that they were able to put together this successful agriculture program in such a short amount of time. And that a lot of the methods that they used and a lot of the vegetables that they grew were the first time that these things were ever grown here within Wyoming. And so they're still very much in use today around the local farms. Now, I will say also in this last slide here that, as Hanako noted, all 10 camps, all 10 of the big WRA camps represented by the black triangles on this map had similar farm programs, most of them extremely successful. And there was a lot of commerce in between them. So in 1943, Heart Mountain was short of onions. And so they sent them up from Granada or Amachi to supply them with onions here. And likewise, in 1944, when Heart Mountain was producing more than it could use, they were sending it off to the other camps as well. And so there was a lot of interaction between the camps as far as farming goes. But of course, the camps were not the only place that farming was taking place. A lot of Japanese Americans moved outside the camps to work in other places. And I'll turn things over to Morgen to talk to you about that.
Thanks, Dakota. So I'm going to be talking about the seasonal leave program that was part of the War Relocation Authority. And just a bit of context, I was the project director of uprooted Japanese American farm labor camps during World War II for 5 years. And this project ultimately produced a traveling exhibit, a collection of oral histories, documentary films, and a website, uprootedexhibit.com. And if folks are interested in the farm labor camp component of the Japanese American wartime experience, I'd encourage you to go there. There are a lot of great resources, including transcripts from the oral histories. Uprooted focused on this so-called seasonal leave program, and the start of the program can be traced to the movement of 15 Japanese Americans from the Portland Assembly Center to a Farm Security Administration camp in Nyssa, Oregon in May of 1942. The camp eventually grew to 350 people and was known as the Camp Without a Fence, which was a name given by the Pacific Citizen. So as we see in the next slide, If we can switch to the thanks. The exhibit itself for Uprooted focused on photographs taken in July of 1942 by FSA photographer Russell Lee. The FSA was a New Deal agency established in 1935, initially to fight rural poverty through various land rehabilitation and resettlement programs. Among its charges was operating camps for migrant laborers, but the start of World War II led to changes for the agency. The FSA, in fact, played a role in the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. As the mass removal began, the FSA was the agency that oversaw the purchase or rental of Japanese and Japanese American owned or operated farms to primarily white operators. Then the establishment of the camp in Nyssa, Oregon, as the first Japanese American farm labor camp signaled another change to the FSA's duties. Prior to the war, the FSA had operated these migratory farm labor camps, which provided housing and health services to mainly white migrant laborers from the American Midwest and South. But there was a national labor shortage during the war, so the FSA started utilizing its camps to house different workers, including Japanese Americans, as well as Mexican, Jamaican, and Bahamian laborers who were imported to the United States through agreements with their respective governments. And as Hanako mentioned, there were also German and Italian prisoners of war that were held in these camps. But the FSA is probably best remembered today for its documentary photography program, and that's where all of these images in the slide are from. It was initially a program that was meant to publicize the agency's efforts, but then it started focusing on introducing America to Americans and to create a visual record of the Great Depression. So if you think of iconic images like that My Grandmother image that's in this slide in the upper left-hand corner, the most iconic images from the Depression are likely from this program. It produced overall 176,000 images, and folks like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Gordon Parks worked for the program. And if you go to the next slide, and Russell Lee. So this is Russell Lee and some of the images that he took. He was the most prolific of the agency's photographers. Over his 7 years with the agency, he took more than 5,000 photographs. And when the United States entered World War II, he was on assignment for something else in California, and he started documenting the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. He took about 600 images of the Japanese American wartime experience in 1942. From July to August of that year, he photographed farm labor camps, starting with the Nyssa camp in Oregon, as well as camps in Rupert, Shelley, and Twin Falls, Idaho. And so I will show primarily images from Lee's work in this talk that I'm giving. So if we can move to the next slide. And Hanako's already mentioned this a bit, but we really centered this project on sugar beets. And this crop was the initial impetus to create farm labor camps that initially housed Japanese Americans. At the start of the war, sugar was a vital commodity. In addition to food use, sugar beets were converted into industrial alcohol and used in the manufacturing of munitions and synthetic rubber. According to the United States Beet Sugar Association in 1943, quote, every time a 16-inch gun was fired, 1/5 of an acre of sugar beets went up in smoke. By 1942, the United States was no longer importing sugar from the Philippines or Java, as they were both under Imperial Japanese occupation. So in response, American farmers increased their sugar beet acreage by 25%. But there weren't enough workers to cultivate and harvest the crops. And many of those who had worked in sugar beet fields in 1941 had left for wartime industrial jobs or military service. So as we'll see in the next slide, sugar beets are an incredibly labor-intensive crop. And so sugar companies, farmers, and state and local officials began appealing to the WRA to utilize incarcerated Japanese Americans as a labor source. And some even eventually submitted requests to President Franklin Roosevelt. As you'll see in these photographs, the crop was all done by hand during the war, cultivated and harvested, and it's known as stoop labor. So you're bent over most of the day. Here in these photographs, people are topping beets, and in the next slide, once they're topped, then they're thrown into trucks. And a sugar beet can weigh up to 7 pounds. So a full day of topping and then tossing very heavy sugar beets is very tiring. And if you look at the two photographs on the bottom, it gives you an idea of scale. And the mountains of beets, these are taken to local sugar companies. So if you go to the next slide. So after getting multiple requests from multiple states, both from government officials as well as private interests, the WRA's response was to create what became known as the Seasonal Leave Program. And this operated for 3 years. As I mentioned at the beginning, the start of this is the opening of the Nissa camp in May of 1942. The WRA defined seasonal leave as work to be accomplished during a specified period of time in a specifically defined area. Most individuals and families who were given clearance to go on seasonal leave had to first be inspected by the FBI. And then they were issued permits that people had to carry around, and those said where and for how long you were allowed to work outside of the incarceration sites. Once you were out on seasonal leave, you could apply for indefinite leave and then permanently leave camp. This was part of the WRA's broader resettlement efforts early during the incarceration period to move Japanese Americans permanently away from the West Coast. There were multiple federal agencies that were involved in the seasonal leave program, obviously the WRA, but also the FSA, the War Food Administration, which took over operation of the farm labor camps from the FSA in 1943, the U.S. Employment Service, which helped recruit Japanese American laborers, and then there were many others, as well as state and local governments and private companies. So when you're researching the topic of sugar beet labor during this period and Japanese American farm labor camps, it can be very complicated because you have to go to multiple archives and repositories. In order to participate in the seasonal leave program, state and local officials were required to submit formal employment agreements that included the following assurances. Officials would maintain order and guarantee the safety of the laborers. Labor would be voluntary. Imported labor would not compete with local labor. And employers would pay prevailing wages and provide housing and transportation. So in this map that we created for the Uprooted exhibit, you can see the tan shaded areas. Those are all counties in which Japanese Americans provided sugar beet labor. And we've also identified the 10 concentration camps, as well as the 4 farm labor camps that Russell Lee photographed. There were dozens of these farm labor camps, but these were the ones that were the center of the Uprooted exhibit. In the next slide, we can see information about recruiting. So sugar companies were the first ones to actively recruit Japanese American laborers from incarceration sites. They went to temporary assembly centers, and then they went to the so-called relocation centers. They also placed advertisements in camp newspapers, and they placed additional recruitment notices on community hall bulletin boards and other public areas. As you can see in these ads right here, they generally emphasize seasonal labor as an opportunity to escape the confines of camp. But then they also ironically marketed the work as the patriotic duty of Japanese Americans, obviously ignoring the fact that the federal government had unjustly incarcerated these people and denied them their civil liberties. Representatives from the sugar companies, as well as U.S. Employment Service staff, worked in employment offices at the camps. So if you were interested in pursuing seasonal leave, individuals would review contracts from sugar beet farmers, and they also did agricultural labor for other crops. And the contracts would tell you the type of work you were going to do, the wages you would be expected to get, and the type of housing. There was a range of housing offered. Some farmers offered living quarters on their own farms, and then there were also the camps operated by the FSA. Generally, choosing to live in a camp operated by the FSA was going to give you better living conditions. They were standardized, and there would be health care provided. So if we go to the next slide, the reception of Japanese American laborers in local communities really varied. People who participated in the program shared information via letters, or they contributed to articles in camp newspapers about their experiences. So people would share, I had a good experience in this part of the country, but less so in this other part of the country. Those working in Western Idaho and Eastern Oregon generally reported being well received, while those working in Montana and Utah experienced blatant hostility and in some instances violence. But enough Japanese Americans reported back to camp that the conditions were favorable during that first period in the spring and summer of 1942, that increasing numbers of people signed up for farm labor work, as you can see in this table we created for the Uprooted exhibit. Initially, it was men who signed up, but increasingly women and families participated, and children were also participating in the labor in some instances. People left the assembly centers and the concentration camps for many reasons. This was an ability to earn better wages. This was an opportunity to escape barbed wire and armed guards, and for some it was a chance to contribute to the war effort. During the 3 years of the program, the WWII helped implement more than 33,000 farm labor contracts. We don't know how many people, because some people participated in the program over time, and a contract was likely issued to one family rather than individuals, but it gives you an idea of this was a significant number of people who were participating in the seasonal leave program. If we move to the next slide, we're just going to quickly go through some photographs that Lee took. So this is the Nissa camp in Oregon, the very first one that kind of marked the start of this program. Lee took about 350 pictures of 4 farm labor camps. These camps, they weren't enclosed by fences and they weren't guarded, but they were still sites of confinement. Residents could only leave the camp, any of these labor camps, if they were escorted by a government official or by an employer, such as a farmer. And there were curfews that people were subjected to. If we move to the next slide, here you can see inside a tent. They were all standard issue. All the tents were identical. Any given family might get 2 to 3 tents for the entire family. If we move to the next slide, one goal that we had with this project was to identify as many individuals in the photographs as possible. Generally, the FSA, through its documentary photography program, didn't identify individuals by name. So we worked with members of the Japanese American communities in Ontario, Oregon, in Portland, across Washington, other places in Oregon, and somewhat in California, to identify people by name. And we did a big social media campaign several years ago. This is the Ochida family. Janet Koda, who is Mary Ochida Takami's daughter, found this photograph on Facebook, and we realized that there were multiple pictures of her family. We were able to identify individuals in about a quarter of the photographs that we had of all 4 camps. In the next slide, we'll see the 3 camps we have in Idaho each represent a different type of camp that the FSA operated. So the Shelley camp, like the Nissa camp, is what's known as a mobile tent camp. And these locations change seasonally depending on where agricultural labor was needed. If you move to the next slide, it's a photograph of the Twin Falls camp. And there are actually still extant buildings at this campsite. It's 2 miles south of Twin Falls. This was a permanent camp. So you see in the foreground, there are barrack styles, similar to what would have been at the concentration camps. And then in the background, you can see there are also small houses. And so the small houses were meant for families and people could live there year round. And the barracks were generally more for individual men and they were seasonal. If you move to the next slide, we can see the inside of one of these barracks in the Twin Falls camp. And they each had 6 apartments that would house 2 to 4 people in each apartment. If we move to the next slide, this was the Rupert camp, and this was actually a converted civilian concentration camp. So this was another type of facility that the FSA took over a lot of CCC camps once the war started, and they just needed housing for the laborers that were working together. If I move to the last slide, the seasonal leave program and the farm labor camps are important for many reasons. One, the program enabled people to leave incarceration sites. About half that participated in the seasonal leave program were able to convert that to indefinite leave. It was estimated at the time that those who participated in the farm labor program saved about 1/5 of the West's sugar beet acreage, again, which was a critical wartime commodity. And the participants helped build significant Japanese American communities in parts of the country. If you take Malheur County, Oregon, for example, which was the site of the Nissa camp, in 1940, there were 137 Japanese Americans living there, which was about half a percentage point of the county's total population. By 1950, that community had grown to 1,200 people, about 5% of the population. And Ontario, Oregon, the biggest town in Malheur County, still maintains a very significant Japanese American population. And it's also important to note that there were about 800 people who participated in the seasonal leave program that first year who had a very different experience during the war than others, because they went straight from temporary assembly centers to farm labor camps and either lived in farm labor camps or were able to convert that to indefinite leave and lived elsewhere. They never went to a concentration camp, and they have a different experience. And if you go to the uprootedexhibit.com website, you can learn about a lot of those individuals. Many went to the Nissa camp and worked in agriculture for the remainder of the war until they either returned to their communities or established new communities elsewhere. But now Elaine is going to share a personal perspective on sugar beet labor recruitment.
Hello, I'm Elaine Koyama. I'm living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so I'm here from the Great Midwest. And my story is a personal one about how one Japanese American, my father, Tom Koyama, left the concentration camp and returned to his roots in Montana. I happen to be the youngest of a family of 8. All of us were raised in Hardin, Montana. It's in the Bighorn River Valley. And my oldest sister was actually born in camp, and I'll return to that in a minute. The research that I'm sharing with you, some come from personal artifacts, and a lot of it is coming from research that I've been doing for a historical novel that I'm working on. Working title is called Tom and Emmy. So on the next slide, I'll give you a little geographic idea of the area that we're talking about. So Hardin, Montana is where my family ended up settling, but we got there by way of Sheridan, Wyoming. So the first circle is Sheridan, Wyoming. Thank you. Sheridan, Wyoming is significant because that's where my father was born. But more importantly, that was where the railroads ended. So there were quite a few Japanese workers who were pretty much left stranded in the Sheridan area because the railroad work ended. Most of us are familiar with the Transcontinental Railroad and the Golden Spike that was driven down in Utah. But after the Transcontinental was built, hundreds and hundreds of spurs and secondary lines had to be built. And that's where where the Japanese workers came into play in a big way. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese workers replaced them on the railroads. And so in a way it was fortunate because they worked on railroad spurs that provided transportation to places like Worland, Wyoming, and Powell, Wyoming, and Hardin, Montana, Crow Agency, Montana. So the railroads ended, and they already had a good idea of where the opportunities were because of where the railroads went. So it's about 75 miles between Sheridan, Wyoming, and Hardin, Montana. Between that is the Crow Indian Reservation. The government had worked on an irrigation project in the Little and Bighorn River valleys so that the water became cultivatable. And the problem for the reservation was the Crow Indians owned the land, but it was held in trust by the government, and they could not sell the land. The Issei could not buy land. So there was a marriage that occurred. Many of the Japanese moved north to the Crow Indian land on the Little Horn River, and they leased the land because they couldn't buy it. And the Crow Indians were able to cultivate land that they couldn't sell anyway. The land was less desirable for most white Americans because they wanted to buy land to begin building equity. So there are a couple stars on this map that didn't show up, but Heart Mountain is about 120 miles away. There's a star down, kind of making a triangle between Sheridan, Hardin, and Heart Mountain. So we're pretty close to Heart Mountain. And then right under the caption is where Missoula, Montana is. And that's where a lot of the Issei were first taken early on before the rest of the evacuation took place. It was one of the Department of Justice camps. Thank you. We'll move to the next slide. To give you a little history of Tom, he was, as I said, born in Sheridan and moved to Hardin area, very active in school. He went through all of his schooling in Crow Agency in Hardin, Montana. Because he didn't know how to play sports, he became a yell king. So he's in the middle of the picture on the left, but it was a way for him to participate and to learn the game. So his sophomore year in high school, he became a player on the varsity squad. And in old newspapers, the Billings paper, there are articles about what a little fast forward he was, oftentimes high point guy, didn't get a lot of rebounds, but he was a leader on the team. And you can see below his picture, he signed it in his script. He was very well known for his cursive writing, and his signature and his writing can be found in several annuals that I've seen through the years. So 1933 happens. He's the oldest of 6 kids. There aren't many other Japanese families in the area, although there was a pocket of Japanese families that had moved up with that railroad group. But the family decided to cash in and move back to Japan, primarily because there were not many other Japanese families for the kids to marry. And the kids, Tom was in his 18, 19 years old. His sisters were not much younger. So they knew that if they wanted to marry other Japanese, they would have to move to a different community. So the next slide shows that they moved from Montana to the Salinas, California area, kind of waiting for the ship to come in that would take them back and also to accrue some more money. They were there for about 3 years, where he worked sugar beets again. So Hardin, Montana, he was working sugar beets for Great Western. He moves to Salinas. He worked sugar beets for Spreckles Sugar. And then he goes back to Japan with the entire family, the 6 children and the parents. And they live in Japan from 1937 to 1940. So the next slide will show he didn't get far. After he came back from Japan, he ended up migrating down to the Guadalupe, Santa Maria area. He was the only one of his family that came back. So he came back with virtually no money. He left the funds with his family in Japan. They were in the Wakayama area. His youngest brother was about 12 when they went. So he was 15 or 16 when he left. But he came back to America to avoid the Japanese draft. So Japan was already fighting in the Pacific prior to this, and they were conscripting any young able-bodied men, and my dad, Tom, fell into that category. So he comes back on one of the last boats back to America, walks down from San Francisco to the Guadalupe, Santa Maria area. They had a large Japanese population. Guadalupe was a town of about 1,200. There were about 800 that were Japanese farm workers. This was around October of 1940. So the next slide shows what can happen when you go to Japan looking for a wife. You come back to America and you find a wife. So he lived in a boarding house. The boarding house also housed Emmy Kubo, who's pictured here at an Obon festival. Emmy caught Tom's eye. It probably would have been a longer courtship. So he returns in October of 40. He's farming. December 7th, 1941, the bomb, Pearl Harbor's bombed. February of 1942, the Issei are taken away. And so Tom and Emmy, which might have been a longer courtship, decide to get married before they're taken away to camp. So in the next slide, you'll see a picture of the white American soldiers marching through Guadalupe. The building in the background was the American Legion Hall, where the Japanese had to congregate when they were taken away. And it's currently the Santa Maria Historical Society. So a lot of my research was done there also. Tom and Emmy decide to get married kind of in a shotgun wedding, but not because they had to, but because of the evacuation. They wanted to stay together, and the only way they could guarantee that was to be married. And they also wanted to be married not while they were in camp. And so they ended up getting married on April 20th. There's some controversy on the actual date, but that happens before they're actually evacuated. Guadalupe community, Santa Maria, that area, first went to the Tulare Assembly Center. They were there for about 5 months, and then they were shipped to Gila River Camp in Arizona. So the next slide gives an idea of the farming opportunities that they had while they were in camp in Gila. They got to Gila in the late fall of 1942. In 1943, the farming really began happening in Gila to establish farm vegetables and produce food for the camps. In that valley, it was already being irrigated, so there was farming going on. My mother relayed stories of picking cotton in the Gila farm area. So outside the camp, there was farming, and they were farm laborers. They would get trucked out in the morning, so the transportation out to the fields. They would have these huge burlap bags that they would pick cotton all day, and then they would go back to camp. So it was day labor kind of thing. But the other opportunities was the Gila camp had their own farm, similar to what we talked about earlier with the Heart Mountain farming. The middle article is where the 3 sugar beet companies, Great Western, Idaho, and Holly Sugar, began recruiting basically the seasonal farm workers that Morgen had talked about. And then the third one that I wanted to put in there, the one that's highlighted, is that they were recruiting workers for Iowa. And so further inland, there was a shortage of workers everywhere. I happened to work for a large agricultural firm right out of college, and I ran into people in Iowa when I was making farm calls who remembered Japanese who were there as chicken sexers, which was a big area that the Japanese Americans went into. So there were the 3 opportunities. There were more than that, but the 3 that jumped out in the Gila area. So the next slide will show, it's a piece of personal history that the Holly Sugar had written for my dad that basically gave him permission to recruit workers at the Rivers and Poston concentration camps. It's signed by a gentleman by the name of Roy Kuhl, who mentored and shepherded my dad throughout his career with the Holly Sugar. The next slide I wanted to show is the victory workers. You've seen ads like this earlier. I pulled out this one section because Roy Kuhl's name is at the top. He was in Hardin, Montana. He needed 4 to 6 workers. But the one that's circled was Harry Mikami. The Mikami family was part of that railroad diaspora that ended up in this. They were in Garryowen, which is right near Crow Agency, right down the road between Sheridan and Hardin. So there were Japanese families that lived in the valley prior to the war and were farming. They were not interned and needed workers just like everybody else. They were all sugar beet workers. The other names on there, several are still working in the valley and families that still live and work in the Bighorn River Valley. The next slide is a piece of personal history. So my parents were were married in 1942. A year later, on April 15th, my sister Carol was born in camp. So during that cotton picking period that my mom talked about, she was also pregnant and realized pretty quickly that picking cotton probably wasn't what she needed to be doing while she was pregnant. So this was April 1943. A month later, in May, the second article, this article was in the Gila newspaper. The first 20-some sugar beet workers left Gila to go to Hardin, Montana. And then around May 22nd, a month and a few days after Carol was born, my parents went north to Montana. An interesting family legend, and probably not legend but truth, is that while my sister was in the hospital, my mom was in the hospital, my sister was an infant, Eleanor Roosevelt came through and held my sister. That was when Eleanor Roosevelt was touring the facilities, making sure things were, people were being treated well. She was a great proponent of the Japanese Americans at the time. So the next slide moves us to Montana. My dad was not a happy camper, and you could see him and a friend were tipping the bottle back after they got back to Montana. The first building shown in the next slide that my parents lived in was a place called Camp Custer. Hardin is in the confluence of the Little and Bighorn River where Custer Battle took place. And Camp Custer, one of those little buildings, they were about a 10 by 15, no running water, no toilets. But it was a little roadside stop, and that was the first place they lived when they got to Hardin. Someone earlier had mentioned the snowstorm in June that helped the crops. My mother relayed that was one of the first times she'd ever seen snow, was when she first moved to Montana, and there was a snowstorm in June. The next couple slides shows some what we used to, as kids, call the labor shacks. So on the farms, usually virtually every farmstead would have a labor shack. And you can see the one picture was taken probably in the 50s, not too well cared for. None of these shacks had running water. Most were small, some that would house maybe one or two laborers. The house on the far right was a larger labor shack on one of our farms when I was growing up. None had running water. They all had outhouses out back. They would haul their water in from the water pumps. They'd usually have a stove, wood burning stove within the camp for heat. Nothing was insulated. So that was what the housing that they were promised looked like. They were also promised a garden plot that I thought was funny, because nothing would grow if it wasn't irrigated. And sometimes these little labor shacks had no irrigation nearby. So they may have been given a plot, but probably couldn't grow anything. The next slide is a nicer labor house. We referred to these as colony houses, and there were several that were right near the sugar beet factory, and then there were several that I was told were built at the fairgrounds, and those were used primarily for the German prisoner of wars. But some of these are still standing. Many have been torn down. The next slide shows you what that colony house looks like today. So most are pretty decrepit. The sugar beet fields in the next slide shows a typical pretty mature field. The smokestack in the background in that building is the holly sugar. And the first harvest in the next slide shows on the side, I'm sure my mother had written 1943. There's a little child in the picture, and I believe my dad standing at the cab of the truck. Those would have been really harvested pretty close to everything by hand and hand thrown up onto the truck. So 1943 was the big year where a lot of the laborers came up to work. The next slide shows that there was competition for labor that came into that Bighorn River Valley. German POWs started coming in towards the end of the season. This is a picture of them marching in. The German prisoner were housed at the fairgrounds in tents. And my mother tells stories that they peeled hundreds of potatoes to cook for the Germans. They didn't cook for the Japanese American laborers. She never relayed stories about cooking for the Japanese, but they provided food. The community provided food for the German POWs. In later articles, there were stories about the Mexican Americans at the time and some Mexican migrants from Mexico. And as I understand, there was a program called Braceros that was a treaty between Mexico and the US to provide workers during the war and later. So as I grew up, there were mostly Mexican migrants that were working the sugar beets. So the next slide, my dad ended up staying from that first recruitment period. He continued to recruit for the holly sugar throughout the war. This invoice is dated January 27th, 1945, where he bought farm equipment to start his farming operation. The invoice says the equipment he bought totaled $8,700, which is about $132,000 in today's dollars. There were things like tractors, grain drills to plant, harrows, cultivators, chicken coop stuff. So he had decided to stay and had made enough money during the war years to buy this equipment. But I also know he leveraged pretty heavily during that, borrowed a lot of money from the banks and and leveraged the Holly Sugar also. In the next slide, it just gives a little recap of the history. He continued farming from 1943 to his death in 1976. In 1970, the Holly Sugar closed, which was decimated the valley. I mean, it was a huge hit. So what my dad did is leverage some friendships with Japanese Americans in the Yakima Valley. He bought peppermint and spearmint rootstock, and we began growing peppermint and spearmint in the Hardin Valley. So to this day, our family still farms there, and right now it's Tom's grandson or grandson who is continuing to farm. And the last picture will show you some of the operation. This was around 1955. Albert Chavez was on the tractor. Joe Beekler was kind of our foreman. And then my dad was the owner of the farm. And I feel like my dad, because of his background, and he provided a lot of work for a lot of different minorities in the community. I remember virtually any African-American, Black American who came through town looking for work. We hired many of the Hispanic families. We all grew up together and we all worked together. That's all I have. Thank you very much for letting me share our story.
Wow, thank you, panel. That was great. I've heard this before, but every time I hear it, there's just new things that I hear. So I'm really glad that we have this on, we're taping this so I can review it. I really appreciate your work and talking to us today about farm labor during World War II. I've always heard that, you know, there were so many Japanese and they made a difference with farms and camps, but I never really knew what that meant. So you really have begun to tell a big story for me. So I was just wondering, Hanako, can people ask me questions, or do they have to be on YouTube to ask me questions? And if they want to ask questions, could you tell them how to go to YouTube? Because I think some people are just clicking the icon. Or Carolyn, could someone tell them how to do that? Well, I think there's a red line there that says YouTube next to the announcements of this program, and you push it and you'll switch to YouTube and you can put your questions in there. Because we're going to start the question and answer segment of this panel discussion. But I do have a special request before we start, which is that we are Ninja's developing a curriculum for students K through 12 and for teachers. And I know there's a real power to personal narratives. You heard that from Elaine. So for our curriculum, we're looking for personal stories, documents, letters, and photographs related to any of the farm labor programs. So if you're interested in sharing with us, please write to me at grace@ninjas.org. And also, let me know if you're a teacher and you would like to be, you're interested in one of our workshops. So with that, we'll go to our first question. And that question is from Lynn Famfa. Her question was, what countries made agreements through the FSA for farm labor, for laborers? So in other words, what other countries?
Yeah,
And-
I can field that. They weren't making the agreements through the Farm Security Administration. It was through the U.S. government. I'm not sure which branch, but I know that at least it was with Mexico through the Bracero program. There's a lot of scholarship on that. It's a very interesting program. Jamaica, the Bahamas, Trinidad, and I don't know if other panelists know of other countries, but those are the ones that I've come across at having people housed in FSA camps.
Oh, so they were all in Bracero programs. So they were on kind of a temporary leave program from their country. Is that
Right, but it wasn't called the Bracero program for the
Uh-huh.
other countries. But
Uh-huh.
yes, there were agreements with other governments of other countries to bring folks over temporarily. So I know that, like at the Twin Falls camp, for example, and Hanako may be able to expand upon this, that there were Japanese Americans, Mexicans, white migrant laborers, Black individuals from Jamaica. It was very diverse, the population at any one camp.
Wow, that's really interesting. So they didn't keep people segregated. I thought maybe they might have been segregated by.
I have heard instances of some segregation, particularly with shower facilities.
Mm-hmm.
They were in the same camp, but I don't know how housing was worked out. But and there was at least one photograph that Russell Lee tried to take showing segregation that was destroyed. So the director of the Farm Security Administration's photography program, Roy Stryker, would punch holes in negatives.
Mm-hmm.
And he did that throughout the program. And so one of the photographs he punched a hole in was Russell Lee trying to show segregated shower facility.
That's really interesting, since we have photos of Jim Crow, but not, yeah. Okay, so let me go on. We have a question here from Paula. How did one, and she has it all capped, person get out from Tule Lake in 1944, given it was a segregation center?
I think I could answer that. So as long as they participate in a leave clearance form, the one thing about Tule Lake people don't recognize is that, yes, it became a segregation center, but you still had a population of people who were yeses that stayed in Tule Lake. So then if they got permission and got sponsored out, they could still leave camp because they weren't seen as one of the segregants. They just happened to be at Tule Lake from the WRA site as it transitioned into, a maximum security prison. But there were still people who were yesers that were at Tule Lake.
Thank you, Hanako. Anybody else? Yeah, that pretty much answers it. So let me, I'm kind of keeping an eye on the time, and we have a couple more questions. And they're both about the farm labor camp. And one was from Fuji Designs. Was it common for whole families to leave camp to work in these labor camps?
Yes.
And you did mention that kids worked. How old were the kids and what did they do?
I've heard just different firsthand accounts of people we interviewed for the Uprooted project. Of there was a man who now he's in his 90s, but he was 8 and he was a water boy was his role. But I knew of teenagers who were out there doing the stoop labor in the sugar beets. It depended on the family, I think. I don't believe that there are any child labor laws in place in these farm labor camps. Yeah, absolutely. Whole families were leaving, and that became a big push of the WRA as the seasonal leave program continued. They wanted whole families to leave and resettle in the interior of the U.S.
And finally, a question from, a couple more questions from Toshimi. Hi, Toshimi. And she's asking, what was daily life like in the labor camp? We need a personal story on that.
Yeah, I can. So sorry, I feel like I'm dominating all the responses, but daily life was like you wake up early, you get picked up in a truck by the farmer you're working for or someone on the farmer's crew. You go to the fields, you work in the fields until about lunchtime, you have a break. You then work again until about 5 or dusk. You come back, you do chores, you make your own dinner, you go to sleep, you repeat the whole thing the next day. And then generally one day during the weekends, you might go into town if the town was a friendly town, to go to the movies or go shopping, and you were escorted.
Okay. And the kids went to the local schools. Did you say that?
Yes, kids went to local schools. There were some teachers at some of the camps, but yeah, kids went to local schools. The school buses came and picked them up. So a lot of folks who are still with us now, Nisei, spoke about, going to Nissa High School or Adrian High School in Eastern Oregon, and graduating from there because they were pulled out of school when the executive order came out.
All right.
Grace,
Yeah.
could I jump in on that? And I think it's something that would be interesting to delve in further. But I knew nothing about the labor camps when I first started working with all of you, that the labor camps were something totally different than the experience my family had as far as being farm laborers. And so I think that story is one that is unique and not very well known in the community, that there were these camps that were very different than being seasonal labor that came into the beet fields from the different internment camps.
Yeah, there is a big story to the labor camps. Maybe next time we can really focus a lot, because I see another question here. Just if we, and I think maybe Hanako could start by answering this question, which is, to what extent did Japanese American families living in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana have exchange or experience with the people in the camps? And maybe
I could start off with that. So I assume that this is talking about during the war, if they were not incarcerated and they're living in the area. So a lot of them had like either minimal exposure to folks who are, whether they're in the WRA site or at the FSA camps, unless they openly wanted to like reach out to them. So at Minidoka, we had a few instances of a couple families where they're living in adjacent communities, and they felt really bad that just because geographically they happened to be beyond the exclusion zone, they did not have to, go to camp. And then so they're, having, just going in to provide support if they're able to. Some people wanted provisions like, milk and other things, and they'll bring it in. And so we've seen exchanges with that with like several different families. But there wasn't like huge populations that were like engaging with the communities that were in like at least the WRA site, because we did have a large Japanese American community in Idaho Falls. But I think a lot of people knew that there was the WRA camp and then there's the FSA sites too. But I don't know how much exchange that they had because they were geographically like remote. It's about 4 hours away from where we're from Minidoka. So I don't, that's all I know about the Idaho part. I'll let other folks talk about the other sites if they know.
anybody else?
Dakota has introduced me to some of the people, the Japanese Americans in that Cody Powell area. And the Ando family is one of them. And Dakota, you probably know more about them than I do, but they would go to dances and do some socializing with the people in camp. but they were clearly not camp people. And so Dakota, you might have a better take on it even.
You know, I was thinking, Elaine, of when you were out here and we were going through, I think it was the scrapbook from your dad's funeral, right? And one of the really interesting things was this, you know, Intermountain Japanese American community, although geographically very, very spread out, was close because we were going through and finding these condolence cards from families that I recognized from down in Moreland, families from up in Billings, of course, but also families from, you know, Salt Lake City and Nebraska, you know, and so these folks were more connected than we give them credit for, you know, and certainly when the camps arrived here, you had quite a bit of interaction with the families in Wyoming, especially here in Northwest Wyoming. That, as Elaine says, you know, quite a few guys would come out to the dances out here, and one of the Ando brothers, the camp veterinarian, Doc Manol Oda, who'd grown up in Cheyenne, married a Heart Mountain girl too, and so there was quite a bit of relationship built there.
And here's another question about payment. How were the laborers paid? And I'm assuming, I don't know if this is in camp or outside of camp. Were they paid in cash or credited in some sort of account in their home WRA camp?
Those who were working in the farm labor camps were paid individually. They signed contracts and they had to be paid prevailing wages by farmers or the sugar companies that they represented. So those were paid to the family or the individuals, to the best of my knowledge.
So yeah, I forgot to talk about the Seabrook. So I was going to bring this up at this time, where some people like got recruited into the cannery business. And a lot of them came from the FSA camps, because my family went from Manzanar to Twin Falls and then to Seabrooks. And the one thing to get them out to Seabrooks in New Jersey was they're like, we will pay you in silver dollars. So that was the big thing that drew my family out there, because they knew that they're going to get paid cash. And it was a way for the community of Seabrooks to try to, you know, I guess mend or have a more favorable view of Japanese Americans, where business owners knew they would hear the clinking of coins of the JAs coming, that they had cash, and then they were going to buy stuff. And so that's just a weird nuance of payment, where over at Seabrooks, they got paid in silver dollars.
And then Seabrooks is in New Jersey, right?
That's correct. And it was a canning facility. And there's still a Japanese American community out there in the area. And I think they have a little museum as well.
Okay, thank you. Dakota, do you want to say anything about the laborers in camps? Because I've heard you talk about volunteer labor also, the payment.
Sure, and that's a big thing, is obviously, you know, the agriculture department employed a lot of folks, you know, and they were paid through the camp system, which basically the WRA had tried to convince the banks in Cody and Powell to come out and set up a branch out at Heart Mountain, and both of them refused. So they kind of ran their own bank within the camp out of the post office up here. But, you know, so much of the farm program was dependent on volunteer labor as well. There weren't nearly enough hands to get things done with just the workers that they had. And so a lot of times there was tension, because they'd want to pull the high schoolers out of school to come and work for them. And the high school principal would be against it. Eventually relented on a few occasions so that they could get crops out of the field. But they were very aware that, you know, there was this hard stop in September where the frosts were going to come. And if they didn't have things out, they were going to be in major trouble. And so it was very all hands on deck. And apparently there was one field that was left in 1943, and that was a field of rutabagas, which everybody decided they didn't like rutabagas anyway. And so they left them to freeze out in the field.
But they dug up the daikon, right?
Right. Yes, all the daikon got up.
Okay, and here's a question about the no-no. Were families of the no-no boys retained in camps, and did they participate in labor camps?
I don't know. I mean, no boys obviously didn't. I have just heard personal accounts of people whose families were had to go through the FBI clearance process. That wasn't implemented when the seasonal leave program first began in 1942, but in 1943, then they realized this was a program they could do, and it became much more intense to pass the program. But I don't know about families of no boys.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just say I'm not aware of the implications of being tied to being a no-no. I have heard, I think some people who are no yes or yes no's, I
Mhm.
think that their families participated, but I think it's because they probably got screened out later. But I don't know specifically about no-nos. And plus, the other thing is, like with the oral histories and when you're speaking to families, sometimes families wouldn't tell their like descendants that they were no-nos, right? Because there's all of that, like the cultural implications, the community implications of outing yourself as a no-no family, right? So I haven't actually done the research, but I think that's a great opportunity for like a grad student to do a thesis.
Mhm.
The potential of so much grad school research that could come out of any of these topics. Like if I had discovered this in grad school, I would have gotten like multiple PhDs. It's just really fascinating. And there's so much to uncover because there are so many entities involved. It's just a really great treasure hunt.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to close this session, to tell you that there's a lot more out there, and to remind you that Ninjas is looking for stories. If you want to write me a brief story of your own family or documents, because we're going to be traveling across the country. I don't know how, maybe in person, maybe on Zoom, but we hope to reach a lot of children, young people with this story. And I want to thank the panel. Thank you, Elaine and Hanako, Dakota, and Morgen. And I want to thank our backstage support, Carolyn and Kimiko and Melissa from Ninjas. And also thank you to this audience, and feel free to write to any of us with your questions or comments. And I want to just say that I've read part of Elaine's book, and when it comes out, you will really enjoy it. And look at Morgen's website, because there were a lot of questions about the Farm Labor Program. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of Tadaima.